A warm welcome, delegates, to our final keynote of the BERA Annual Conference 2021. We've been hoping to welcome Professor Sundaram to the BERA conference for some years, and so it's a particular delight that she's able to be with us this year for our final keynote. Vanita is a professor of education at the University of York, where her research broadly covers gender and education, focusing specifically on gender-based violence and teenagers, tackling everyday sexism, harassment and abuse in education across the life course, and sexual violence in higher education, all topics that should be concern for all of us. Vanita is the author of numerous publications, including her latest book, co-authored with Professor Carolyn Jackson, Lad Culture in Higher Education, Sexism, Sexual Harassment and Violence. Vanita's work has been drawn on by government inquiries into sexual harassment, violence in education, and she's acted as advisor to national policy-making bodies, including the University UK Task Force on Staff-Student Sexual Misconduct in Higher Education. She's also chair of the International Gender and Education Association. So it is therefore with great pleasure that I now give the floor to Vanita for her keynote presentation. And as she's speaking, please do put your comments, your chats into the chat at the side of the screen, and we'll have some time at the end to ask Vanita some further follow-up questions. Vanita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that really generous introduction, Mary. I really appreciate it. I wanted to thank firstly the organising committee and Mary specifically for inviting me to speak at the conference. It's a really huge privilege to be able to speak about some of my work at BERA, and particularly in such esteemed company alongside the other three keynotes we've heard from this week too. I'd also like to explicitly acknowledge and give thanks to generations and communities of feminist scholars and mentors for enabling and laying the foundations for the work that I'm going to be talking about today. Specifically, I'll be referring to work that I've conducted in collaboration with Carolyn Jackson, as Mary mentioned, Pam Aldred, Alison Phipps, Tiffany Page, and Erin Shannon in this talk. I'll also be trying to work through some new ideas based on this work, so I'm really grateful for feedback and discussion after the talk. I will really miss not being able to engage in this discussion face-to-face in person, but I'm hopeful that we can find some way to engage with each other through the chat, which Mary is so kindly moderating for me. So I'd like to start by giving an overview of the key points I'll be making in this talk. Firstly, I'll be arguing that sexism, sexual harassment, and violence, specifically in education, are not a problem of individuals. They are structurally, institutionally, and culturally embedded. Secondly, I'd like to ask whether we can consider education settings to be a conducive context for sexual violence at those three levels, at the level of the structural, the institutional, and the cultural. And then thirdly, I'd like to consider possibilities and challenges to transformative action that might enable culture change in educational institutions. So in thinking about violence, my work draws on Liz Kelly's concept of a continuum of sexual violence. Here, sexual violence is an umbrella term which refers to any contact or non-contact activity of a sexual nature that's unwanted. So Kelly defines the continuum of sexual violence thus: any physical, visual, verbal, or sexual act that is experienced by the woman or girl at the time or later as a threat, invasion, or assault that has the effect of hurting her or degrading her, and/or takes away her ability to control intimate contact. Kelly's definition and ours clearly prioritizes the impact on the survivor in its conceptualization of violence. Even though Kelly's definition refers to the survivor as a woman or a girl, we operate with a broader understanding of the dynamics of violence that is trans-inclusive and that recognizes the multiple gender dynamics within which violence may be enacted. Violence is conceptualized as existing in multiple and overlapping forms, ranging through sexist language, rape jokes, image-based abuse, and sexual assault or rape. So in my work with Carolyn Jackson, we draw on an understanding of violence which centers power, understood as fluid, relational, interactional, and structural, and which understands violence in terms of the harm caused to the recipient, rather than in terms of particular types of acts or behaviors. It's key to our analysis to prioritize the way in which harm is perceived and felt by recipients, in order to extend our understanding of violence itself and it's key to creating a culture of care and empathy in which survivors' accounts of their experiences are accepted. We understand gender-based violence as being deeply rooted in gender inequality, in the norms expected of and attributed to people on the basis of gender and gendered identities, and gendered power imbalances at the individual, systemic, and structural level. So gender, for us, is a necessary component of analysis of violence. However, we don't see gender on its own, much less a binary or static conceptualization of gender, as sufficient to understanding how violence is enacted and experienced, precisely because it does not account for the different forms and relations of power in producing violence. Pam Aldred and Miriam David have sought to demonstrate the links between different forms of violence and between violence and power relations in their work. They argue that violence clearly relates to the concept of gender, but is not only structured by the primary axis of gender inequality. Gender-related violence might be more broadly defined to include violence that is enabled by the very concept of gender, and so recognizes gender normativity, the insistence on a gender binary, homophobia, transphobia, and the injuries of women's inequality to men. This is crucial to being able to visibilize intersections between gender and other marginalized characteristics. So in this talk, I'll be referring to gender-related violence, which encompasses a myriad of forms of violence, including sexist and sexualized harassment and violence. So, why think about gender-related violence in education? As many of you are familiar with already, we know that gender-related violence occurs in a range of educational settings, including in schools, in further education, and in higher education. The NUS studies of higher education and further education students' experiences suggest that unwanted sexualized comments and harassing behaviors are fairly prevalent. In the 2010 Hidden Mark study by the NUS, 68% of women were found to have been sexually harassed in or around their universities. In a later study that included women and men students, 2/3 reported having witnessed unwanted sexual advances towards their peers. In a 2019 NUS study of sexual violence in FE, half of the students in that survey reported experiencing unwanted sexual comments, and 1/3 of reports of sexual harassment had taken place at college itself. Recently, more attention has been paid to different dynamics of abuse, including staff-to-student misconduct or harassment. A 2018 NUS study in collaboration with the 1752 group thus found that 41% of current or former students had been harassed by a member of staff. A recent UCU study also found that university staff themselves report experiencing sexual harassment at work. And my recent work with Carolyn Jackson suggests that university staff encounter so-called lad culture in a range of forms, including verbal threats of rape, image-based abuse, degrading and sexualized language used in teaching and learning spaces, and sexual assault. Annis Stenson's recent doctoral research has also shown that university subcultures, including lad culture, constitute a fertile context for sexual harassment and violence. The racialized dimensions to sexual harassment are evident in the 2018 NUS study, which found that 7% of students of color said they'd experienced sexualized comments referencing their race specifically. The recent Ofsted review of sexual harassment in schools characterized sexist and sexualized harassment as so frequent that it could be considered commonplace in schools. Despite the widespread shock expressed in the media, particularly to the findings of the Ofsted review, a vast body of feminist research has shown the prevalence of sexism, gender-related harassment, and violence in schools. Catherine Atkinson has shown in her doctoral work that boys as young as 5 use objectifying language to discuss their female peers' appearance. A Women and Equalities Commission inquiry into sexual harassment in schools in 2016 found that girls as young as 7 to 12 had experienced jokes of a sexual nature from boys. The Ofsted review itself found that 92% of girls experienced sexist name-calling, that 80% were put under pressure to send sexual images of themselves to others, and 79% had experienced some form of sexual assault. There is a vast body of historic feminist research which demonstrates how sexualized and gender-related harassment permeates primary and secondary school contexts. So Eleanor Formby and E.J. Reynolds' work has shown how boys who do not conform to gender expectations experience homophobic harassment. Amanda Keddy and Kerry Robinson's work has shown how sexual harassment is used to intimidate and police conformity to gender norms. And Becky Francis showed already in the late 90s that sexism was prevalent as a means of gender control, even among primary age pupils. And this is just a flavour of the kind of work that feminist scholars have been engaging in for some time now. So I want to think then about how can we think about spaces that enable? What are the features of educational spaces that facilitate gender-related violence? And here we draw on Liz Kelly's work on sexual violence and specifically on her concept of conducive contexts. Liz Kelly notes that a range of contexts are conducive to violence against women, including the family, institutions, public space, and online spaces. But what's less well theorized is what connects them. What makes these spaces ones that enable men's violence towards women and girls? While the focus of our work has been on gender-related violence more broadly, and therefore on violence perpetrated towards people of all genders and within multiple sets of power relations, we use this fundamental concept of conducive contexts to consider what features of particular settings enable gender-related violence. So we know that gender-related violence is embedded in cultural norms for gender behaviour. A primary risk factor for the perpetration of gender-related harassment and violence is gender inequality, and specifically contexts that are characterized by unequal gender power relations are conducive to gender-based violence. So how does this relate to education? Well, we know from a vast body of feminist research and education that, as E.J. Reynolds has phrased it, schools are a key site for the production and reproduction of gender relations and sexual identities. As Catherine Atkinson notes, primary schools have consistently been revealed as fundamentally heterosexualized institutions, centrally implicated in the reproduction and regulation of gender and heteronormativity. Children learn appropriate gender behaviour and practice heterosexuality already in the earliest years of primary school, including through participation in heterosexual relationships. Katja Gordin's work has argued that the normalisation of heterosexual gender performances allows sexual harassment to occur and to be concealed through discourses of romance, even in the younger years of primary school. So global evidence shows that adherence to markers of traditional masculinity, such as heterosexual success, aggression, dominance and control over women, and sexual entitlement, are strongly linked to an acceptance of violence against women. Work that's been done with young people in secondary schools also demonstrates the centrality of gender norms to their acceptance of violence. Violence is justified with reference to gender expectations of both boys and girls, and especially when girls are viewed as transgressing norms for feminine behaviour within relationships. Violence is not only normalised, but seen as a demonstration of appropriate masculinity within heterosexual romantic relationships. Elizabeth Meyer has noted that teachers' perceptions of normal gender behaviour underpin a lack of response to gender-related harassment, which in turn reinforces the primacy of heterosexual masculinity in schools. So it's important to note that we don't understand gendered identities as unified or as static, but draw on the post-structuralist notion that, as Kerry Robinson articulates it, individuals are shifting subjects who are volatile, contradictory, and changing. This suggests the complexities of how individuals take up gendered identities within the structural, discursive, and cultural locations they're positioned in. This is also important to thinking about the contexts within which gender-related harassment occurs, as well as the complexities and contradictions of such practices. So educational institutions have long been understood as microcosms of society, so it's perhaps not surprising that wider patterns of inequality are reflected. But what is it that makes them specifically enabling or conducive contexts for gender-related violence? I draw on Carol Hageman-White's model of pathways to violence perpetration and Raewyn Connell's conceptualization of the gender regime here to think about how educational settings can be thought of as conducive contexts for sexism, gender-related harassment and violence. How do risk factors for perpetration intersect with organizational features which exacerbate these risk factors or even create them? As Bakshi has argued, the culture of an institution can inadvertently or knowingly support sexual harassment and allow it to flourish. So Hageman-White's framework draws broadly on ecological systems theory to outline 4 intersecting levels that impact on each other in the production of gendered power relations and therefore in the production or facilitation of violence. These levels of influence are outlined at the macro, so the societal or systemic, the meso, the structural and institutional, the micro, which refers to the interpersonal and cultural, and the ontogenetic, which refers to the individual level. So, for example, the macro level refers to unequal power relations between men and women, the ritualized subordination of women through laws and policies against violence. The meso level might refer to social norms and practices that regulate daily life, including discrimination against women and girls in education, rape myths and misperceptions that permeate the criminal justice system and that produce shame and stigma for survivors of violence. The micro level might refer to day-to-day interactions that produce conditions that facilitate gender violence. These include rigid norms for what's considered normal gender behavior and persistent myths or misperceptions about gender violence in a particular cultural context. The ontogenetic or individual level refers in Hageman White's model to personal characteristics or beliefs that support the perpetration of gender violence, including rigid understandings of masculinity that support hostility, a lack of empathy towards women, or early exposure to abuse in the home. So in terms of thinking about how educational settings or organizations facilitate and enable gender-related violence, it's therefore important to think about how they facilitate gender inequality. Joan Acker's work has noted the ways in which organizations are not gender neutral, but are structured around highly gendered assumptions about the worker. All organizations have inequality regimes, defined loosely as interrelated practices, processes, actions, and meanings that result in and maintain class, gender, and racialized inequalities within particular organizations. This relates to, for example, the organization of labor, recruitment, and hiring. As Joan Acker puts it, white bodies are often preferred. Relates to assessments of competence, which involve judgments that are not gender, race, class, or disability neutral. And it relates to informal interactions and practices while doing the work, as Acker terms it, that routinely use gender, race, and class-based assumptions about those with whom they interact. So I draw further on Raewyn Connell's work on the gender regime of organizations to understand gender patterns in public sector organizations. She understands particular relations of gender being embedded at the level of power relations, including the gendering of occupations, the gender distribution of labor, including organizational hierarchy, human relations and emotional work, including solidarity and antagonism formed along gender lines, and prevailing beliefs and culture about gender within organizations. As Raewyn Connell has pointed out, the local gender regime of an organization is likely to mirror the wider gender regime in society, but may also depart from it. And this is where I think I'll be talking about spaces for hope later on. So I try to draw these frameworks together to characterize three overarching and overlapping levels at which gender inequality as a risk factor for gender-related violence is constituted in educational settings. The structural and systemic, the institutional, which includes social norms and institutional cultural practice, and cultural, including prevailing gender beliefs and day-to-day interactions. So the structural level may include gendered power relations within an organization and a weak infrastructure for responding to gender-related violence. The institutional level may include gendered divisions of labor or poor implementations of policies against violence. And the cultural level may include attachments formed along gender lines, including solidarity and prejudice, as well as persistent stereotypes about gender and about gender-related violence. Drawing on Emilia Roy, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Patricia Hill Collins' work on intersectionality and the way interlocking forms of oppression are enacted through social institutions, my work with Carolyn Jackson and with Alison Phipps and Tiffany Page has argued that the notion of the gender regime should be extended to incorporate other intersecting inequalities, including race, ethnicity, disability, class, and sexuality. Crenshaw has noted the importance of seeing these markers of identity as markers of hierarchy, and Roy reminds us of the need to recenter the historical, institutional, and structural dimensions of discrimination, in other words, of upholding these hierarchies. Carolyn Jackson and I have therefore argued in our recent book that universities can be considered spaces that are conducive to intersectional forms of gender-related harassment and violence. For example, violence on the basis of gender and race, or gender and sexuality. And in the next section of this lecture, I will consider how universities specifically may enable gender and other forms of inequality, and thus gender-related harassment and violence. So Alison Phipps's work has shown the ways in which wider systemic issues uphold inequalities, for example, through an increasingly marketized and competitively individualized sector that reinforces unequal power relations and that centers the voices and needs of the most privileged within the system. As she argues, universities are the discourse of a meritocratic free market, but continue to work in favor of the ruling class. This focus on the market and relatedly on reputation leads to the airbrushing of blemishes that detract from the market value of the institution. Phipps's work shows how cases of sexual violence are swept under the carpet, are airbrushed out of public view in order to preserve the appearance of the institution and to ensure the continuity of crucial income streams, such as student income. This might be done either through institutional failure to respond appropriately to allegations or by allowing the perpetrator to withdraw quietly or to be gently removed so that the problem is never discovered. Existing research has demonstrated that university structures and systems and policies and processes for responding to sexual violence invisibilize sexual violence through covering it up, for example, through NDAs or settlements. They exhaust complainants to the point that their reports are withdrawn or obfuscate the process to such an extent that the case disappears in the system. Structural factors thus inhibit a survivor-oriented response and enable gender-related violence to persist and to be invisibilized within these institutions. Erin Shannon, building on Alison Phipps's work, has also discussed how institutions betray survivors by valuing perpetrators. Her work points to structural aspects that facilitate the silencing of survivors and the prioritization of perpetrators whose value to their institutions is perceived to be greater and therefore to boost the market value of the university. This includes a highly decentralized infrastructure in UK universities in terms of siloed working of support staff, a lack of communication between welfare services, a lack of clarity about where to report, and in terms of how to access support. The process of disclosing experiences of violence becomes labor-intensive in such systems, and Erin Shannon draws on Sarah Ahmed's concept of exhaustion as a management technique to explore barriers to survivors disclosing sexual violence in universities, including how these barriers pose a risk for re-traumatization. A 2016 UCU study also found that unsupportive institutional structures resulted in the dismissal of complaints. Complainants felt excluded from reporting processes or were made to feel responsible in some way for the violence perpetrated against them. Turning to inequality at the institutional level. In terms of staff, we know from existing public data that the representation of women remains low in senior positions and that women face overt and implicit discrimination in relation to accessing promotions, secure and full-time employment, and equal pay to male peers. Multiple marginalisation occurs, institutionally speaking, when gender intersects with class, race, faith, sexuality, disability, and combinations of these. The pervasiveness of institutionalized racism in higher education has been well documented by Kalwant-Bhopal's work. This includes exclusion from decision-making spaces, cultural insensitivity, and racist bullying and harassment. In terms of the distribution of power and labour, there's a clear underrepresentation of so-called BAME staff in UK universities, with 9.4% in 2016 and 17, and particularly at leadership and management levels in academic and in professional and support service roles. Institutionalized inequality is also reflected within institutional policies to respond to gender-related violence, in terms of their visibility, suitability, accessibility, and application. Such policies are often buried within layers of institutional web pages, and the policies themselves are not always fit for purpose. As Anna Bull and her colleagues note, reporting complaints processes often exclude students as they're positioned as witnesses to the incident rather than as centrally involved. Anna Bull and Rachel Rye found in their analysis of 61 policies on student-staff relationships across 25 UK higher education institutions that at that time, only 2 included definitions of consent. As of 2020, only 6 universities in the UK prohibit sexual and romantic relationships between staff and students where there's a teaching or learning relationship. The distribution of labour within the university is gendered in a number of ways, as shown by existing research, including Penny Jane Burke's work. Caring work is more generally disproportionately carried out by women, and pastoral support to survivors, in particular, is most often provided by women, as shown by Erin Shannon, amongst others. Anna Bull and Tiffany Page have noted that gender inequality is, of course, not the only form of power imbalance that facilitates abuse. For example, other forms of power can explain violence in same-sex relationships and staff-student relationships, including income inequality, age, and educational status. And these are also likely to be relevant axes of inequality within higher education contexts. So in my work with Carolyn Jackson, and Mary referred to our most recent book in her introduction, we've argued that universities can be understood as contexts that enable or are conducive to sexism, gender-related harassment and violence. And here we pay particular attention to institutional and cultural features. There's evidence from our work to show that social and institutional norms and practices and day-to-day culture and interactions in universities facilitate gender inequality and specifically enable the persistence of sexual harassment and violence. Based on our study of 72 participants across 6 universities and on a European research project which was led by Pam Aldred that developed first responder training for university staff, we show that university staff hold beliefs about gender and about violence that serve to dismiss, overlook, or trivialize so-called lad culture, and therefore enable it to persist, often without consequence. Work with university staff in a range of roles, from welfare officers to security staff to pro-vice chancellors, found that misperceptions around usual or normal gender behaviour, how gender-related violence happens, who it happens to, and its impacts are prevalent. Misunderstandings about sexual violence also occur among student leaders in universities, and beliefs about gender underpin these misunderstandings too. We found that even after research-informed training about sexual violence and how to appropriately respond to disclosures, skepticism around survivor accounts persisted. There was resistance to understanding of sexual harassment and violence as gendered. There was resistance to the notion that it was prevalent. There was a naturalization of inequalities to legitimate inequalities themselves. And there was a persistence of victim blaming, for example, through problematic understandings of consent. So just want to share some data from those studies with you. So we found that whilst a number of staff were able to identify encounters with lad culture or sexualized harassment and violence and could name it as being related to gender norms or sexism more generally, there was a significant number of our participants who engaged in the normalisation, invisibilisation and trivialisation of violence, either overtly or implicitly. So I've picked out some quotes here to share with you. A male head of department from our study says, "All I can say is that I've been here 21 years and I've not handled more than 5 or 10 cases. In the grand scheme of things, students are affected more by depression, anxiety and anorexia. They're more prevalent." So there seems to be a lack of understanding or recognition that depression, anxiety and anorexia are closely related to experiences of gender-related harassment and violence. And I would invite you to think about what a response might be if somebody had come across 5 or 10 stabbings, for example, in their university career as a supervisor or a head of department. A male director of a campus service which specifically supported students said, "I've never come across it, never seen it. Maybe there's a problem underlying somewhere, but I've never come across it." And then a director of another campus service that also had a welfare directed role, or welfare facing role, says, "It goes back to when I was a kid in the summer holidays. You went off in the morning and came back at 6:30 at night with your knees grazed up. Nowadays, people don't let their kids out in case they get abducted. So I wonder whether any of these things are really increasing these days." So the invisibility that we see here is also related to limited and inaccurate conceptualizations of what actually constitutes sexual or gender-related harassment and violence. For many staff, only extreme cases of harassment or physical assaults were understood as constituting sexualized harassment, which in turn impacted on their perception of its prevalence. So in terms of the ways in which university staff normalised gender-related harassment and violence, biological determinist discourses of gender were quite often drawn upon to narrate gender-related violence as natural or to minimize the responsibility of men and boys with regard to their behaviors. This discourse positioned men and boys as naive, sometimes as innocent, and other times as victims of their naturalized and static gender position within this context. And here this mirrors other research, perhaps in school contexts, on the perceived innocence of boys and the supposed wiliness of girls in sexually harassed encounters, a narrative which invisibilizes gendered and other forms of power. So again, I'd like to share some quotes with you from our study. In the first quote, Welfare Dean, who's a woman, says, some of them, referring to young men who've been brought to her attention for perpetrating sexualized harassment, some of them didn't even realize it was sexual harassment. They thought it was just boys being boys. It was actually quite surprising that this sexy banter is actually harassment. A male head of school says, one of the things about being male is that you just don't know. Low-level comments are just wrongly perceived. And a teaching and learning coordinator says, some of them have difficulty interpreting boundaries. Those are the kinds of things we see. And she's referring to non-consensual sex with someone who's asleep or unconscious, rather than full-on criminal behavior. So there's an echoing here of what Becky Francis and what Carol Leithwood and Barbara Reid have termed the boy turn in educational research and practice. The notion that boys are actually victims in education contexts and systems which prioritize the needs of girls and which overlook the naturalized pedagogical and social emotional needs of boys. The prevalence of gender-related harassment was underestimated, and that was linked to a trivialisation of the impact of harassment and violence for survivors, which again speaks to the notion that staff most often viewed only physical harassment or assault as constituting something that was worthy of paying attention to. So a male head of security in one of our institutions says, I wouldn't say for a moment that it's predominant in any way. I've had female students come and report unwanted attention or assaults or non-consensual, but I've never had the feeling this was a massive problem, or there were dozens of these cases. And I also quite strongly have the feeling that it's very much disapproved of by the vast majority of students, male and female. So I certainly think it exists, but I don't think it predominates. Male member of staff working for student support services says, I suppose there are instances of laddism once or twice a year that I'm aware of. I wouldn't say it's endemic, and I wouldn't say it happens all the time, but there are certain times of year at the end of the academic year, large sporting events, where it's more likely to happen. So an understanding of so-called lad culture, gender-related harassment or violence occurring in particular contexts, but also the sense that unless it's happening all the time, right under your nose, there's no need to take the extent of it too seriously. And certainly the impacts here are not acknowledged at all. And it's interesting that the threshold for taking sexual violence seriously is so much higher than for other forms of behaviour that are punished at universities. So ironically, when sexual harassment was recognised by staff and by student leaders as pervasive, this became used as a reason to not report it. It was seen as so commonplace that it became normalised. So a female SU member of staff says, like I say, I don't know what it would take to take it seriously. It's like, what would you say to report? Because I could give you 20 reports from one night out. A student mentor, who's also a woman, says, yes, there's been loads of times I've been out with girls and they will tell me, do you mind staying with me now? There's this guy who keeps wanting to touch my bum, or something like that. And it's quite minor. And I think maybe they're not affected by it because it's more accepted, but it comes to the point where it's quite common. And the girls, I think, would expect for someone maybe to be a bit untoward towards them. And I think that's where the issue is. It's people now feel that it's because it's so common on nights out that you just have to accept it. Thus, its ubiquity contributes to its invisibility, as it's not made visible to higher education institutions by students or by staff through formal complaints processes or official policies. As Sarah Ahmed and Kimberly Crenshaw have pointed out in different ways, when we cannot see the problem, we cannot name it. Responding to an unnamed problem clearly has its limitations, not least in terms of what Sarah Ahmed describes as being heard as complaining. Ahmed notes that when women are heard as complaining, they are not heard, and so the in plain sight invisibility of gender-related harassment and violence is maintained. So I'm in the beginning stages of developing some work that seeks to examine how schools may be considered contexts that are conducive to sexual harassment and violence, using Hageman White and Connell's models, amongst others, to theorise this. So Amanda Kelly's work has argued that school environments are not conducive to recognising the harmful impacts of sexual harassment and proposed remedies to this. They remain a conducive context for supporting gender relationships that reinforce an acceptance of sexual harassment. Nicole Conroy has proposed that if the gender regime of a school normalises stereotypical views of gender, supports unequal power relations between men and women, and fosters gendered divisions of labour, then gender-related harassment and violence may be more easily normalised or dismissed. The hidden curriculum may thus enforce gender-related values and practices through a range of practices, for example, the organisation of classrooms, teacher discourse, allocation of classroom roles, school toilet spaces, and uniforms. And a range of research has already established this, of course. Sexual harassment is normalised at the organisational level in a number of ways. Katcha-Gardine's work has argued that these include not following legal duties to follow up on complaints of sexual harassment, ignorance about legal duties of the school, ineffectual consequences for perpetrators, a lack of monitoring of existing complaints, an absence of whole school plans for addressing gender-related harassment, and a lack of policies regarding sexual harassment other than bullying policies that don't recognise what Gruber and Finneran have termed the pernicious effects of gender and sexual stereotypes. Amanda Kelly's work has shown that frequently used sanctions for perpetration of sexual harassment, including discipline slips and detentions, can antagonise rather than prevent or improve behaviours relating to gender-related harassment. Rather, as Carrie Robinson's work shows, behavioural transgressions are seen as a badge of appropriate masculinity. A key and persisting issue here is that schools tend to shift the responsibility from the organisational level to the individual level, as a problem at the level of individual relationships, focusing on the behaviour of the victim survivor as well as the perpetrator. Elizabeth Meyer has noted that at the institutional level, barriers to intervention in gender-related violence include a lack of institutional support, a lack of knowledge, understanding, and training about what constitutes sexual harassment, a lack of understanding about gender and power, and an inconsistent response from colleagues to complaints. Workload demands also prevent teachers from acting as consistently as they'd like to. And this mirrors findings in higher education regarding staff feeling like support to survivors is not a core aspect of their jobs, and so it's additional to their workload. At the level of school culture, teacher and pupil beliefs about gender behaviour underlie the normalisation, trivialisation, and even dismissal of the existence and impact of sexualised harassment in school. Teachers are resistant to addressing sexuality and homophobia. Sexual harassment tends to be seen only as physical by pupils and teachers, and victims are viewed as exaggerating or as being dramatic. Amanda Kelly has noted that gendered collusion can exist between male teachers and pupils, which can minimise practices of harassment and therefore trivialise its impacts and potential consequences and responses to it. And Carrie Robinson's work has shown that the normalisation of derogatory sexualised language within practices of compulsory heterosexuality means that teachers find it difficult to challenge. As one teacher in some of her work puts it, it's like stopping a snowstorm with an umbrella. So in drawing together sort of an already vast historical body of feminist scholarship, we can begin to consider schools as specifically enabling or conducive contexts for gender-related violence. In this final section of my talk, though, I'd like to think about possibilities for disrupting inequality, for disrupting power relations within those contexts, as well as challenges. And initially, I'll be focusing on higher education, as that's the site of my most recent work. So in universities, one of the key challenges with existing violence prevention models is their failure to adopt an intersectional lens and to actively recognise the ways in which subjects are differentially positioned in matrices of power, and then to take action to redistribute this power or to protect marginalised subjects from additional risk. A collaborative project with Alison Phipps, Tiffany Page, and Aaron Shannon generated the concept of shared vulnerability as a key issue to consider in developing violence prevention, specifically initiatives that require intervention in or disruption of violent encounters. we define the concept of shared vulnerability as the shared characteristics of marginalisation or vulnerability that a person may have with a survivor, and that may position them at additional risk if they intervene or attempt to disrupt violence occurring on the basis of those characteristics, for example, disability or faith. Working with this concept in violence prevention allows active recognition that power is unequally distributed in a range of ways, and allows us to think about who is best positioned and when to disrupt, challenge, or intervene in different contexts. Thinking intersectionally offers us additional possibilities. As Joan Acker has noted, institutionally speaking, a delimited focus on distinct areas of inequality as unrelated or as singularly experienced tends to uphold existing structures of organizational inequality. Rosemary Deem and Louise Morley have noted that institutional inequalities policies have tended to move towards a more recognitional politics, which celebrates student and staff diversity, but without acknowledging inequalities of power at multiple levels. An intersectional lens can demand of us to move away from an ordered culture of equality, in which equality can be ticked off as achieved through measurable actions, but that don't actually disrupt unequal relations of power or visibilize privilege. Alison Phipps and her colleagues in the Changing University Cultures Collective have emphasized the need for institutional self-critique, a need to speak in to the institution about inequalities, rather than performative speaking out about equalities initiatives and so on. They note that a focus on values, honest self-examination, and political consciousness, rather than a prioritization of metrics and reputation or status, is necessary to creating non-violent institutions. Penny Jane Burke's work on emotion and caring pedagogies in higher education also notes that the move to marketization is tied up with the regulation of difference and pushes us further from our sense of human interdependence, connectivity, and social belonging, and this emotion being key to creating non-violent spaces. So is this realistic to achieve in educational institutions? The prevention of gender-related violence can take place at different levels, in terms of primary prevention, so preventing violence before it occurs, secondary prevention, which refers to approaches targeted at particular individuals and groups who are at risk of perpetration or victimization, or tertiary prevention, and this refers to approaches that address violence once it's happened or to prevent violence from recurring. University approaches tend to fall into the category of tertiary prevention, responding to violence, or not, as the case often is, once it has happened. In terms of thinking about the shift to primary prevention, visibilizing problems and different perspectives is fundamental to disrupting power differentials. As Joan Acker puts it, one privilege of the privileged is not to see their privilege. Actions such as disrupting peer cultures that support gender-related harassment and violence, challenging myths about gender-related violence, promoting an ethics of care through education need to be supported by structure, by institutional practices and norms, and through a culture of empathy, honesty, and self-awareness. This is challenging in a sector context that prioritizes competition and reputation. Phipps and McDonnell argue in their recent paper that change within spaces that replicate existing inequalities of power will inevitably be limited and may perpetuate inequality. Drawing on Audre Lorde, they argue that the university is the master's house. From the perspective of white institutional equality and diversity committees, it appears that the furniture merely needs a polish rather than the whole house being a perilous place. They draw on Sarah Ahmed's concept of non-performativity, which she identifies as discourse, language, and practice that does not produce the effects it names, but stands in for them instead. They draw on this to argue that institutions document inequalities, then point to this documentation as the equalities work, rather than tackling the inequalities themselves. Bhopal and Henderson have also pointed to the limitations of equality charter marks to initiate conversations and generate action to address inequality. As Ahmed says, often such initiatives are about changing the perception of the institution as unequal, rather than changing the fact that it is. Sexual violence training programs can therefore become non-performative if not done within a fuller context of tackling, rather than simply documenting, inequalities at each of the levels of structure, organization, and culture. Phipps and McDonald argue that universities can thus simply reaffirm themselves with the language of improvement. In terms of work in schools, the End Violence Against Women Coalition has argued that violence prevention must be supported by a structural and systemic approach, for example, through relationships and sex education, and the integration of work on gender stereotypes and sexualization across curriculum subjects. However, Catherine Atkinson's work shows how even when schools do engage with a feminist or pro-liberation ethos through curricular and institutional initiatives, normative accounts of gender and homophobia persist among children's peer group cultures. So here I draw on E.J. Reynolds and Esther McGeeney's work about conducive contexts for enabling solidarity and the importance of being with young people rather than working on or about them in their work on gender justice. They draw on Karen Barad's concept of responsibility to argue that in research designed to understand the experiences, ideas, and feelings of young people, we must be particularly attuned to relations of power and to enabling the voices and experiences of the designated other, rather than looking for the right response. They also acknowledge the importance of political, legislative, and curricular support to create conducive contexts for meaningfully engaging with young people. As Alison Phipps terms it, engaging with them in, but not of, the institution. Deb Ollis's recent work with Leanne Cole has similarly emphasized the importance of speculative working that facilitates new, unanticipated ideas, feelings and enactments, and ones that might run counter to hegemonic narratives or expectations about the right response. And some of this work was really beautifully illuminated in some fantastic symposia that took place yesterday and today about enabling young people in contexts that uphold normative hierarchies. So we can draw on these ideas around disruptions of existing hierarchies to inform higher education practice. Anita Sundari's work with Ruth Lewis and Susan Marine has pointed to feminist and decolonial activism within universities as already constituting collective resistance and solidarity in practice. Alison Phipps draws on traditions of non-reformative reform to suggest the formation of small, self-organized groups of staff and students who imagine new ways of relating and solving problems together outside of the institutional machinery of equality and diversity and the persisting inequalities of power that characterize those spaces. Katie Vigers' keynote lecture on Monday also spoke strongly to collective action, to what she called little acts of solidarity as a foundation for resistance and change in universities. And Phipps and McDonald say that these prototypes could be used to develop initiatives which create structures of accountability rather than shoring up the institution's power. So to conclude, and without being uncritically optimistic, I think that although education settings do produce and reinforce gender and other inequalities, and therefore enable gender-related violence, there are spaces for generating change, resistance, and solidarity. These spaces can exist outside of traditional and hierarchical institutional structures and can influence local cultures. "We are the university" was a common refrain on the picket line during the 2018 UCU strike, perhaps a useful analogy for imagining what is possible through collective resistance, disruption, and solidarity. And I'll end there, but I'll just scroll through the references I drew on for this talk just for the benefit of the recording.
Thank you so much, Vanita. That was so enlightening. I think working in a different area of the discipline, I really found some of the statistics you showed us at the beginning really very disturbing. And we have some questions in. Thank you so much for that. I found it absolutely fascinating. But we have questions and we have comments, and I'm going to start first of all, because I know that you referenced her work, with a comment by Pam Aldred. That was a wonderful keynote read, and such a brilliant model of recognising the work of others that we build on. So many citations, thanks too for such clarity about the work that needs to be done. And with that in mind, I think our first question, Jean Hatton has commented on the fact that, brilliant information in stats, but there seem to be a lot more women attending than men. So with that in mind, but probably broadening it out further, what do you think the main obstacles to research in this area are? And do you think there's a difference between doing work in higher education and doing work in schools?
Well, that's a big question. So in relation to there being more women in this talk, I can't see who's here.
Yes, we can't see.
It's fairly standard that more women than men attend talks like this about this particular topic. And of course, education tends to be a field that is dominated in some senses by women researchers and practitioners. I think in terms of obstacles, there are many, but one that I'm coming into contact with increasingly, and I'm sure that my fellow researchers in this field can recognize this, is the obstacle of university ethics committees and the positioning of this work as inherently risky or somehow dangerous to engage not only children and young people with, but also fully grown adults with. And I think that risk can be conceptualized in different ways. So I think part of the risk lies in fears about maybe reputational damage of doing this kind of research to higher education institutions. And some of it lies in a willful ignorance of the very active cultures of children and young people and the many ways in which they interact and talk with each other about gender and sexualities already. So I would say, just on a practical note, that's one of the major obstacles that I've been coming across, not only for myself, but for my PhD students seeking to work in this area and do research specifically on sexual violence and sexual violence among marginalised communities as well.
That intersection between the marginalised communities seems to come up so often. And I'm going to read out, you'll have realised, many of you, that now that some of you have chaired sessions, we're on a different tab for the questions. So it's a little bit like, passing your head and rubbing your tummy. So I'm working across two tabs. Laura Hennessy has asked, thank you for speaking about this. I have just returned to classroom teaching and was both glad to see that there is now a whole section on peer-to-peer sexual harassment in keeping children safe in education, although saddened that this is necessary. How do you empower young people to reject the normalisation of laddism and sexy banter?
That's a really good question. And there will be people in this audience and people who presented their work across the week who are able to speak very powerfully about this. So including E.J. Reynolds, Leanne Cole, Gabriel Ivinson. In fact, I've just attended their talks today and yesterday, and they had some really wonderful ideas for how we can work, as I termed it, in the institution, but not of the institution. So working outside of those spaces that perpetuate normative relations of power. But I mean, I think one of the key things to think about is, of course, structural and systemic responses. So sexualities education that acknowledges and elicits in different ways the experiences of children and young people and their experiences of gender and sexualities. I've noted that the new relationship and sexuality, or relationship and sex education guidance from the DFE does now mention trans identities, and it mentions same-sex family relationships in a much more embedded way than it did before. But there are still very few references to, for example, consent or kind of gender inequality, gender stereotypes, and how we might challenge those more generally. I would encourage you to look at the work of a range of scholars that I've referenced today, but also, as I say, the work of E.J. Reynolds, Kate Marston, Leanne Cole, and others for some really fabulous, creative, participatory methods for engaging young people's voices and for really kind of disrupting that traditional hierarchy between teacher and student, between researcher and participant, really giving voice to their experiences in ways that we might not be able to imagine if we think about these issues in those very traditional, narrow, limiting ways.
That whole nothing for us without us agenda is very close to my heart. And this is from somebody who's remained anonymous, but she says, thanks, Vanita. Maybe I can highlight another aspect relating to my experience. And I'm reading this one out because actually we seem to have quite a lot of practitioners in this session. In my second year in teaching, a male pupil touched me, female, inappropriately during a lesson. Other pupils witnessed it. I was so shocked, self-questioning about what had happened. It took me a couple of hours to confide in a colleague who was male. He persuaded me to speak to my line manager, and she was supportive, and the school did take action. But now hearing you and looking back 5 years later, I wonder if I should have demanded more from the school. And I guess it's just, that agency question, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And first of all, I'm sorry that happened to you. I think your question and your experience really points to the need for institutional accountability and for structures and systems that enable that kind of accountability, because I think part of the problem is when these issues get devolved to the level of the individual, it becomes much easier to sweep under the carpet, it becomes much easier to dismiss, much easier to question yourself, and these experiences can become trivialized by others. So I think some of the work I referred to today, the researchers were saying that the lack of consistent response from their colleagues, the lack of belief from their colleagues, further entrenched the invisibilization of sexual harassment as an experience within schools. So as to should you have done more, I mean, I think it really points as well to the fluid nature of power relations and the ways in which we're constituted differently in different kind of structural and cultural and discursive locations. Eloise Simmons has done some really interesting work on how these power relations are not necessarily being subverted, but changing in the context of higher education. So, for example, where the traditional teacher-student power relationship is changing and maybe becoming displaced in favor of a more kind of consumer service provider type relationship, and how that shapes our experiences of power in these different contexts. So, yeah, I think that's what I would say on that.
Thank you. And David Lundy has asked, since the Donnellan versus King's College London case in 1993, there's a long-standing precedent in UK universities of not investigating rape and sexual assault internally, letting the police and CPS investigate, and acting after law enforcement have concluded their work. There has been discussion recently of universities having internal disciplinary procedures with a lower threshold than the criminal law on sexual assault. Do you think universities should be investigating these matters themselves? And if so, what steps do we need to take to avoid becoming amateur versions of the criminal courts?
That's a really good question and a really big question. There's scholars like Anna Bull and Tiffany Page who've written about guidance for universities, specifically thinking about staff-student relationships. I think I would say, there's a difference in relation to kind of supporting survivors between disclosing your experience and reporting your experience. And I think one of the things that universities really need to work on is the ways in which they can support survivors who are disclosing. That's one of the major barriers to disclosure, is the lack of pathways for disclosing, the lack of a supportive and empathetic response, as well as the lack of clarity around how to access support. And I think that sits differently to investigation of cases. I think there's a range of approaches to justice and to how we conceptualize justice for survivors. And I've been really kind of pleased to read some work by Claire McGlynn and Nicole Westmoreland and Julia Downs on the notion of kaleidoscopic justice and drawing on survivors' voices in terms of what justice might look like. And their work really shows that there's it's not an ending or a result, it's a process. And there's lots of elements in that process that look like justice for survivors. The key kind of elements of which are voice, participation, a recognition of their perspective and the hurt that's been caused, and consequence, but not necessarily consequence that's punitive. And I think Holder has argued that a good outcome very rarely looks like a punitive outcome in relation to sexual violence. So I think there is that distinction to be made between supporting survivors who disclose, which is kind of the focus of what I've been talking about, and investigating through criminal justice systems and those processes.
Thank you so much. Our time is up. I'm sorry I didn't get round to all the questions, but I know that Vanita would be open to receiving emails and contacts through the platform. I note in the discussion as well, there's quite a few references to supportive materials around ethics in this area. And I will just highlight that there's a comment that the Sexualities and Gender BERA SIG Special Interest Group are currently organising a one-day conference. Everyone's invited, addressing sexual harassment and violence in primary and secondary and special schools next spring, early summer. So do look out for that event. And I know that since this was such a rich presentation, I know that people will be pleased to hear that it will be available in recorded form until the end of September, because I know that many of us will want to go back and look up some of those references. But it just leaves me to thank you so much again, Vanita. I'm struck again, as you mentioned also, the parallels between yourself and our first keynote. Both of you seem to surface individuals, staff, student realities that are sitting behind those glossy educational institute brochures that we all see. And I think that's what keynotes at conferences like this give us the opportunity to do. So thank you so much. It's so good to have you here. And
thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just to mention, we've got 2 more parallel sessions this afternoon, folks. The ECR Twilight session, and I'll be doing a wrap up at about 5:30. So hopefully see you at lots of those sessions. Thank you.